Is June 20th, and I'm here with my friend Kate Pogue. We are visiting this afternoon after having a nice Italian lunch, and Kate has been giving Shakespeare classes for many years, and I have been a student off and on for some of those years. I believe, Kate, the first time I was in one of your classes was over at the Montrose Library, and I don't recall what year that was. But I know that I've known Kate for at least between 20 and 25 years, where we met over at 5353 Institute Lane. And Kate and her husband Bill still live on Institute Lane. And I'm going to let Kate tell you a little bit about her Shakespeare classes, when she started teaching those classes in Houston. And for those residents like myself that were lucky enough to join her, we have been recipients of her wonderful scholarly research and book publication. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you started doing your volunteer teaching. I know you've been a professor or teaching at different universities and colleges, and you've been a producer and a director. But first, I'd like to know, with your Shakespeare classes that you've been giving to the community, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I actually started teaching my first Shakespeare class in 1973, I think, at the Alley Theatre, when we had first moved to Houston. And I was teaching at the Alley Theatre merry-go-round class for the young people, but my great pleasure was teaching a nighttime class of Shakespeare. And at first I thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I have no idea. I was just 25 years old, and I hadn't taught before, but I had a great enthusiasm, and I think enthusiasm it's very good for teaching. It tends to make the class more exciting. So anyway, they publicized the class, and I had about 20 adult actors, and we worked on some Shakespeare. Then I was lucky enough, as time went by, to meet Larry Mers at Houston Community College. And as time went by, he wanted me to teach at the community college and to establish their first drama department. So I was able to do that, which started to formalize my teaching structure. And I taught for quite a while at HCC, until finally in the year 2000, I decided that I would retire. So in 2000, I thought I want to retire, but I want to retire to something rather than from something, in hopes to make my retirement more fun. So when I taught my last Shakespeare class at HCC, I went to the Montrose Library, and I said I would like to continue teaching, and I wondered if we could do a class maybe every week. And they looked rather horrified and said they didn't think people would come every week. So I said, how about then once a month? And it was a Monday, and so we decided to do third Monday Shakespeare, meaning every third Monday of the month we would do a Shakespeare class at the Montrose Library. And for me, I realized that in spite of my years and years of teaching Shakespeare, I still hadn't read all of the plays and all of the poems. So my goal was to teach for 3 years, 9 plays a year, and 9 times 3 is how much? 27, 36, whatever. That if I would teach at that schedule, we would, as a group, read all of the plays. So with that particular class, we just started with the first play, and I talked a little bit about the background of the play and why Shakespeare had written this particular history. And then I had clips of the play to show people, and we had copies of the play for people to read from. And sure enough, in 9 years, we read 36 plays, and that got me started on the path that I'm still on today.
You were over there for several years at Montrose Library, and I guess I was one of your students there at the beginning when you first shifted to the volunteer work over at Montrose Library. And then I don't know how many years you were there, but then you migrated over to the West University Senior Center. Would you like to talk a little about that, how that happened?
Sure, it's fun to look out now at my class at the West University Senior Center and see faces like Deirdre's and Kathy Oliver in particular, who date back to the classes at the Montrose Library. So the wonderful thing about the West University Senior Center is they have welcomed me there, and there's quite a following of people who would continue to be interested in reading Shakespeare. This time, however, having done the 4 years, and my math is all screwy, I can see somebody thinking, what is she adding and subtracting here that doesn't add up? But when I did the 4 years and the complete works of William Shakespeare at the library, instead of doing just an introduction to a play, I decided I was interested in reading the whole play. So the format changed when we went over to the Westview Senior Center, and we now just choose a play. This play that we're doing right now is King Lear, and it was suggested by one of the students in the class, and it seemed an apropos choice. So we start with King Lear and we read the whole thing, each person in the class taking a different part. And it sometimes takes us 6 or 8 weeks to read a whole play, because we read it and then we see the video that shows really good actors reading what we had just read through. And so that's the format of the class that I teach currently.
So these classes have been offered multiple times, and you have repeat attendees. Some of these people are so taken with your enthusiasm and your presentations, they continue, and they've done many repetitions of the class. They are a really wholehearted Shakespeare enthusiast and Kate Pogue enthusiast, I think. But I know you just come back from a celebration with your husband. You were at a Shakespeare, it was kind of a celebration, also a personal celebration. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things that encouraged me to think that I might have something to offer as a Shakespeare teacher is that I spent the first 2 years of the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis as part of that remarkable company. When I was a drama student at Northwestern University, where I got my bachelor's degree, I discovered in studying theater there that what I really enjoyed was classical theater and Shakespeare plays. And so when the Guthrie Theatre announced that they were going to establish a theater company to do classical plays in Minneapolis, and they were going to open up this possibility to students who wanted to do classical theater and get a graduate degree at the same time, that the student could do that if they were accepted into this program. And then when they came, when it was time for them to get their degree, they could either go on professionally or go on academically. And the people who founded this theater company were extraordinary. It was Tyrone Guthrie, who was at that time considered to be the finest director of the English-speaking stage. He had just spent years at the Old Vic with John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier and the great luminaries of the time, doing innovative productions of Shakespeare's plays. But it came from a very strong classic background. And so it was Dr. Guthrie who said, I don't see any classical theater companies in the United States. I will found one for any community that wants one. And Minneapolis won the toss. They wanted it badly enough. And I read about it in the Chicago Tribune, and I read that there was this possibility to do a graduate degree and work with this theater company. So, you know, I think all of us, as we get older, recognize that we have in our times been just lucky And for me to say I want to do classical theater, and for Tyrone Guthrie to found a theater company that would absorb people like me, was extraordinary. And so I was quite thrilled to be a part of that founding of that theater. And at the same time, my husband applied for the same program. So we met up. We'd met once before, but we met up again at the University of Minnesota in 1963 for the founding of the Guthrie Theatre. And I think what you referred to a minute ago, Deirdre, this event that happened a couple months ago was a celebration of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Guthrie Theatre. And my husband and I were in that company, and he actually was the first actor to set foot on the Guthrie stage 60 years ago. And although most of the people now are gone, 60 years is a long time, my husband and I decided we'd like to go up to Minneapolis to see the production of Hamlet that they were doing to celebrate the 60th anniversary. And so we did, and we got a backstage tour, and we met some of the actors, and was altogether a very happy celebration of a time when we were happy together, and when we also were learning from these extraordinarily brilliant English directors and actors.
So you and Bill both had a fellowship for this program, I believe, and with the fellowship, it enabled you to be there for, was it a year or 2 years? How long was it?
With you mean for the initial founding of the company? What they wanted, Dr. Guthrie had said that he was distressed because in America, you didn't go to university to study acting to go into the professional theater. You studied acting to teach acting to people who would teach acting, who would then teach acting. And he thought there's something missing here, and that is a connection between training and professional activity. So they opened up this graduate study program. So we were called McKnight Scholars because the McKnight Foundation funded this program. And there were about 6 of us that first year, 4 actors and 2 actresses, plus some designers and front of the house people. And they scheduled us so that we would have a semester at the university getting our graduate degree, and then a semester working on the production of the plays with the theater company. And that's how that came together, and I think has been thought to be rather successful. The program is still going.
So a lot of this was educational and bringing things to the community that hadn't been there before.
Right.
And I think in the interview that you did for NPR in Minneapolis when you were there, they stated that there was some type of, they felt there was a vacuum, or they were trying to do something different from Broadway.
Right.
Could you talk a little about that?
Well, the Broadway theater sort of has always set the standard for American theater production and acting, and the center of the theater in the United States has gravitated towards Broadway, where all of the finest professional American actors have trained and done their best work. But that means that the kind of theater that they do in England, where they now have a national theater company, have had for a long time, the Old Globe Theater, the great theaters that have done professional classical theater didn't exist in this country. There was a vacuum, and that was what Guthrie thought he could fill and open up this whole realm of classical theater to America in a way that we hadn't had before. And the great experiment that he did with this was in Stratford-on-Avon in Canada, where there is a Stratford Shakespeare Theatre Company that was founded 3 or 4 years before the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis, but set the pattern for how this could work with American and Canadian actors, and has been completely successful. It's just announced their season for next year, which is at least 12 plays spanning the whole generations of great theater here as well as in Canada.
So, Kate, I remember or recall that you mentioned something about you and your husband Bill meeting for the first time at Northwestern, where you were enrolled as undergraduate students, both of you. I don't know if you were enrolled in the theater program or what program you were studying. You might tell a little about that, but at any rate, you had no idea that you were going to meet up again a little bit later when you were about 23 years old at the Guthrie Theatre. So maybe you could talk about the little transition there from when you first met at Northwestern and then how you just happened to be in the same program in Minneapolis.
Looking back, it's always interesting to see how you meet somebody that's important in your life, I think. And I went to Northwestern because I wanted to do theater, and I lived in Evanston at that time. And the Northwestern had an excellent theater department, so I signed up. And Bill had gone to a Northwestern High School Institute a couple of years before that, and that got him interested in the Northwestern as a destination for college. So we both wound up at Northwestern. We were 19, I think, when we first met. And we did 2 years of university training at Northwestern. And meantime, he decided he didn't like Northwestern after all and was wanting to transfer schools. And so he transferred to the University of Denver. And I was unhappy at Northwestern. By the way, we think Northwestern is a great school now, so I'm not complaining in any way, but just sometimes the transition from high school to college is difficult. So anyway, we met at Northwestern. We had 2 summers of summer stock, doing 10 plays a summer. That was run by the drama teacher at Northwestern, so we got to know each other there. And then Bill went to Denver, and I took a junior year abroad in France, and we didn't see each other for a year or two. And then when I got back, I applied to the Guthrie program. I was really excited about going to Minneapolis. It was a wonderful opportunity. And when they listed the people who'd been chosen for these McKnight fellowships, there on the list was Bill's name, and I had no idea that he had applied from Denver. He had no idea that I had applied from Northwestern, but we both wound up in Minneapolis at that time. And when we each were given these McKnight scholarships that got us our graduate degrees and also our time at the Guthrie Theatre, we started, and nobody knew exactly how this was going to work out. It was an exciting time because the theater was just a hole in the ground. We watched it being built. We had to rehearse in a church across the way because the theater wasn't ready. We were opening 2 plays in the spring of 1963, the Hamlet and Molière's The Miser, but then in the spring we had 2 more plays to rehearse. And so the scheduling of it was very tricky because there was so much going on. And I also appreciated the fact that they really worked hard to give us a lot of professional opportunities, workshop plays, audition training, movement skills training. It was a real extraordinary graduate program. And so I think when I got to teach at the Alley or subsequently, I've drawn completely on those experiences, beginning in 1963 and continuing to today. The 60-year anniversary goes on.
It sounds like it was a very comprehensive and long-lasting learning experience that you could transition from one job and one role to another role, because you've been an actress, you've been a director, you've been a producer, you're an author. You had to do a lot of research on your subjects that you've written about. But most of all, I think your enthusiasm with whatever you do is always present. So I'm glad I'm a beneficiary. Kate, you mentioned going abroad the year that was more or less a transition year after you finished at Northwestern. Is that correct?
Yes,
And you were there for a year, so that must have been an interesting experience, and you must have had some interest in France or something drew you there.
it was remarkable. It was a wonderful year, and curious that there are always trade offs because who would not love a year in Paris? I mean, it was just a dream come true. And yet I was losing a year of contacts and training by choosing to go to France instead of staying at Northwestern. So it was, you look back at your life and you see how things have worked out. But one of the interesting things about my year in France was I went with Sweetbriar University to their junior year abroad program, and they arranged some fascinating classes for us, both at the Louvre in history of art, history of music, but also theater. And so we were going to the theater 3 or 4 nights a week and seeing remarkable productions. The capital of France has a wonderful history of theater and drama and acting and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that have influenced my life following that was that we saw a production called 1,000 francs reward, 1,000 francs de récompense, which was a play written by Victor Hugo. It was his only foray into melodrama, which was a very popular form at that time. So we saw this wonderful production, and I remembered it. It was one of my favorite things that I saw when we were over there. So when I got to Minneapolis and was getting my master's degree, I had to do a master's thesis. And I wasn't at that time a researcher. I've sort of turned into one in my older years, but at that time, I thought research was just kind of boring. So I wanted to do something a little different. And I thought, if there's never been a translation or a performance in the United States of this play by Victor Hugo, maybe that's what I can do for my thesis, which they allowed me to do. I had to do enough biographical background to introduce it and fit it into Victor Hugo's life. But then I did a translation of 1,000 francs reward, and that got me my master's degree. And then it was performed at the Round Top. There's a theater forum that I was asked to put together for the Festival Hill at Theater in Round Top, Texas. And one year we did French theater, and we had a staged reading of this play that I had originally translated. So it's fun to see how things can weave their way in and out your whole lifespan. You never know when something's going to suddenly pay off.
Oh, that sounds like a very scholarly objective there. You had to speak French fluently to be able to accomplish what you did with your thesis.
I did. I would hesitate to say French fluently because you get so aware of your deficiencies in language when you're trying to keep up with a deep culture like the French. But I did learn to speak enough that when I had to come home at the end of the year, I could pick up the phone and in French call the person to come and pick up my luggage. And they understood me and I understood them. And I thought, it's been worth a year to have learned some of the French and then to get acquainted with this wonderful play.
Kate, when it was May, I saw you in May when I had this brainstorm. And I remember you're saying something about this being that maybe you and Bill were the only ones there that had been there in 1960, or 63, excuse me, 63, for the celebration.
Yeah.
So you were a rare entity there present at this celebration of the Guthrie Theatre. And you must have, I know you did this interview with NPR there, and of course many years have passed since that time, but I guess that made it even more special that the two of you were there together And
Yeah, it was, we missed the others. We had gone up there 10 years before for the 50th anniversary, but there, for some reason, and we never could quite understand why, they didn't make a big deal of the 50th. So when we got to the 60th, we thought, well, we're going to try again to go up there and just touch base with our youth. And then they were interested. And we were the only people from our year from that 60th anniversary company that was there. So that was felt very important, very special.
so, Kate, you've told me about your work at Houston Community College. You were in the 1980s working with a Shakespeare by the Book festival. I believe that was the title. In the mid 1980s. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this was an extremely valuable opportunity for me. I had directed my first play at Houston Community College. One of the first ones was Midsummer Night's Dream, and then I decided to do As You Like It. And the reason for that was when people ask me what got you interested in Shakespeare, I go back to when I was 11 years old. My mother took me to an Evanston High School production of As You Like It. And I was watching this play, and it can't have been, I mean, it was a high school production. It can't have been brilliant. But I sat there thinking, those people on the stage are having such a wonderful time, and they're speaking such wonderful language, and they're wearing such pretty clothes. And I don't want to be sitting here. I want to be up there on that stage with them. So luckily for me, my high school did a Shakespeare play every year, so I got to do some of that. And then we've already gone over my background at Northwestern, and the summer stock performances, where we also did some Shakespeare. So by the time I got to Houston Community College, I was ready to do some more, thinking what a valuable thing it is for young people to act Shakespeare. It's just a remarkable opportunity, and to be in a position to create that for people was exciting to me. So what happened was there's this library in Fort Bend County, the George Memorial Library, which had built an outdoor Shakespeare theater into the side of the library. And there was a woman there, Sylvia Powers, who was excited about doing Shakespeare plays in their facility. And they had done a production of Much Ado About Nothing, but they were trying to do it on an amateur basis, and they just didn't have the background or the time or the focus to do that. So they read in the newspaper that at Houston Community College, where I was, we were doing a production of Twelfth Night. So they called and they said, would we be willing to bring our production of Twelfth Night to Fort Bend County? And all I could think of was, I'm going to get my students able to play Shakespeare outdoors. Isn't this the most fabulous thing? So we put out a call for auditions and took this production to what they called the Shakespeare by the Book Festival, because it was in a library, and we were doing things by the book. So we did that production of Twelfth Night. And then I was talking afterwards with the Sylvia Powers from the library, and I said, I think it's really gone well, Sylvia. She said, oh, I do too. And I said, and I think we should. And she said, do 2 next year. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. So for 10 years or more, we did 2 Shakespeare plays at the Shakespeare by the Book Festival. And that gave me the ability to choose and produce and direct and teach Shakespeare classes and have this one. And you can imagine how I drew on those years at the Guthrie when I was having to do the producing and the directing, and tried to remember everything I had learned from those extraordinary people.
Did you have all of your notes and things saved from when you were
Well,
back
I'm
in
sure
college?
I wished I had even more. I'm not a very good documentarian, but yes, as much as I could remember, and to work with people who also had done I did some work with Sidney Berger and the Shakespeare Festival in Houston, and so there was a lot going on at that time that helped me by my being able to draw on that Guthrie experience.
So is that when you said Fort Bend, is that correct? Was that Richmond, Texas?
Yes, Richmond, Texas. It's in
Yes.
Fort Bend County.
Yes, that was a beautiful library. I went to one of those productions in the summer, correct? It was
Yes.
in the summer.
Yep.
Yeah, and it was like an amphitheater out there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And we had people, we had jugglers, and we had musicians, and we had people selling turkey legs, and it was a whole summer Shakespeare experience right there in Fort Bend County. It was great.
That was fun to start something from scratch like that you were able to improvise with the person who was interested there. It
Right.
takes the right person to make that happen.
And I think they were lucky to have Sylvia, because after she left, there was one person afterwards, Joyce Kennerly. And after Joyce left the library, the new librarian had no interest in producing plays at all, and the whole thing fell apart. But we'd had 12 good years.
Yeah. So, Kate, I believe you mentioned something about being at Notre Dame. Maybe this was a summer production that you started, and you went up there maybe 2 years. This was about the time that you were doing the productions in Richmond, Texas, with the Shakespeare by the Book. So that's a really, were you familiar with Notre Dame, or how did you get up there?
I had a very good friend named Carol McLeod who was teaching English at Notre Dame because her husband, John McLeod, was the coach of the basketball team at Notre Dame. And I had gotten to know Carol in a couple of years that Bill and I spent in Phoenix. So Carol said, they're going to be starting, there's an English teacher here who wants to start a Shakespeare festival for summers at Notre Dame, and I wondered if you wanted to direct up there. And I thought, oh, this has been going to be interesting and exciting if they accept me, because it's a whole level up from what I had been doing. For instance, we drove into Chicago to do auditions for this professional company. My companies had always been academic companies with just a few professionals, but this one was to be a professional company. And the man sitting next to me, the producer, Paul Rathburn, actually said, when he talked about hiring actors and designers, he said, money is no object. You don't hear that in the arts very often, or in the theater. Money is always an object, and you're always having to make do. But they were wanting to establish something on a very high professional level, and they were raising money to do that. And I was lucky enough that they asked me to do the first 2 years. And meantime, at the Shakespeare by the Book Festival, I'd been working with a colleague, John Corley, who was wonderfully enthusiastic. And whenever we did 2 plays in the summer, I would direct one and he would direct the other. So when I went to Notre Dame for those 2 summers, he was able to keep the Shakespeare by the Book Festival going. And so that's how that worked out. And I had the pleasure of working with both of those wonderful companies. And then when we came back, as time went by, the Shakespeare by the Book closed down. And the times at Houston Community College were not as fun as they were when we first started, because there were many more restrictions being put on what community colleges could offer from the Texas Coordinating Board. And so some of it wasn't quite as much fun. So I thought, maybe it's time for me to retire. This was the year 2000. I was turning 60. I thought it's time to reinvent my life. I think I will retire from HCC and see what happens next. And so, once again, wanting to retire to something rather than from something, or a combination of the two, I thought, what am I going to do now? And I was teaching a Shakespeare class that I taught every Monday night. And when we were starting that particular class, my final year there, I said I was going to retire, and as I was watching my actors do their scenes in class, I became aware that a lot of the scenes that they were doing had to do with friendships. And I started to observe that a lot of Shakespeare's plays rest on friendship or are built on friendship. And then I looked deeper and I found that all of them were, except for 2 or 3 of his least successful plays. His most successful plays always had at their foundation friendship. And so then, of course, I thought, if he writes constantly about friends and friendship, what was his own experience? It must have been good, because here he's doing all this writing about friends. And so I looked for a book that would tell me about Shakespeare's friends, and to my surprise, there wasn't one. And then I thought, oh, I need to write this book. There's nobody more overwritten about than Shakespeare. Books pour out about Shakespeare every single year. And if you get a new idea, you're sort of obliged to follow through on it. You can't turn this gift down. And that's what I thought, I'll retire and I'll write a book on Shakespeare's friends. And then as I did that, I realized the same thing could be said about his family, that it needs more explanation. We don't have a really good book that talks about Shakespeare's family. And so when I look back these years and years when I didn't want to be a researcher in college, here suddenly I was retiring and turning into a researcher.
Kate, you had an inspiration for writing these books with Shakespeare and Friends, Shakespeare's Family, and you have a whole stack here of books. But I think that you made such a transition that it's worthy of some time to talk about the books, because that took a lot of time to think about and write about and then research.
When I was getting ready to retire from Houston Community College, I was looking for a project that might be of interest. And I was teaching this Monday night class on scenes from Shakespeare. And it suddenly occurred to me that he was writing a lot about friends. And then I looked at some of his book titles and realized that a lot of his books were about friends. And then, because things seemed to move sort of slowly in my mind, I think, it finally occurred to me that if he wrote a lot about friends and wrote positively about friendship, surely he had some interesting friends. So I went looking for this book called Shakespeare's Friends, and I couldn't find one. There was no book out there. Every biography of Shakespeare would give a nod to a few people who were his friends, but there was no book that really told us what his friendships were and what they were like. And so I thought, that's it. That's my retirement project. I will look up and see if I can write a book on Shakespeare's friends. And so as I finished that particular book, I realized that the same observation was true about Shakespeare's family, that there was no book completely about his family that people might want to read when they get curious about his family. So I wrote that a second book about his family, and then I thought, surely this is all I'm going to write. But I was at a Shakespeare conference after I'd written these 2 books, and I was listening to some English professors talking about teaching English, and they were tossing around words that I barely knew. Words like stickamithia and solecismos, and what are some others here?
Those are archaic words, would you say?
Ploche. These are words that describe figures of speech, and they were the foundation of all education when Shakespeare was a boy and going all the way through his adult years. And when you get to know that he was using all of these figures of speech, it changes the way you read him, because he writes in these predisposed patterns, things that he had learned when he was in school. And so once again, I thought, where's a book about Shakespeare's figures of speech? And there wasn't one. There were books on rhetoric, general books about everybody's use of rhetoric, but there wasn't a single book that focused on the terms that Shakespeare used in such a way that we could appreciate that. So that was my third writing into a Shakespeare need. I just thought people need to be able to look up easily what Shakespeare's figures of speech were, and so I wrote that particular book. And then the last two, most recently, I was tired of hearing that Shakespeare couldn't have written his plays. I don't have any belief at all that anybody else had anything to do with Shakespeare's plays. He is the writer. He may have collaborated with friends here and there, but basically the 36 plays in the first folio are plays written by Shakespeare and have to do with his particular education. And so I thought, what I need to do is write a book about his education so that people will know that he was extremely well educated for the kind of work he wanted to do. And I meant to bring that book along, and I forgot. Oh. So it's called Shakespeare's Education, not hard to remember. And I think it's an important book because, once again, it goes step by step through this process of his education so that we understand how it was he learned to write the plays that he wrote. And then finally, I wrote this little book called The Shakespeare Treasury. I chose 52 of Shakespeare's most familiar, greatest speeches. And if you read one a week for 52 weeks, you've given yourself quite a Shakespeare education. So that's a little book called The Shakespeare Treasury.
So over what period of time did you write these 5 books?
I started the figures of speech in 2000, and so what? It's 23 years now. And I never set out to write all of them. I finished one and then would think, oh, but there's this other subject out here that I need to address.
Have you had any more thoughts about any other gaps?
Oh, I do, but I'm getting old and tired. My excitement now is with a new movement headed up by Ben and David Crystal called Original Pronunciation. And that is exploring how the English language sounded in Shakespeare's day and what it gives the actor to access that accent rather than to use an American accent or a received British accent. And it's a really wonderful way to hear his language. And if I have the time and the energy, that's, I think, what I'm going to work on.
Kate, can you understand the pronunciation? Can you follow it, or do you have to have a course in how to understand it after you hear it?
Basically, you can understand it pretty well if the people do it correctly. It sounds a bit like an Irish accent or a Scottish accent because there's a lot of northern influence in Shakespeare's language. And there's a little speech from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it's about Titania's flower bed where she's lying, and it's a speech that lends itself very much to the sound of the language then. And the speech in modern English goes, I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine and sweet eglantine. And in Shakespeare's language, it would go, I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine. So it's not hard to understand at all. But it's a different sound. And what I was eager and remain eager to explore is what sounds did Shakespeare have in his mind when he wrote his verses, and what does it give an actor to access those sounds as opposed to contemporary sounds? It's a wonderful field. Any young actor could have a great deal of fun in the next few years exploring original pronunciation.
So, Kate, one of the high points of your career was a trip to Edinburgh, the festival, the Fringe Festival, I believe, and you took a production there. This was about 4 years ago. And could you tell us about that trip and that adventure and the production, and how did that go?
Well, I was just getting interested in original pronunciation, and I was walking through the green room at the theater at the University of Houston downtown where I was teaching. And I ran across a student of mine who's now on the faculty at U of H downtown, a man named Luke Fidel, and I directed him in several of the Shakespeare by the Book plays. And he stopped me and he said, Kate, I really want to work on Mark Antony. And I said, Luke, I really want to work on original pronunciation. So between the two of us, we found 6 other actors. So we had 7 actors, all of whom had done shows at U of H downtown and Shakespeare by the Book. So I'd worked, they were actually almost semi-professional actors, not just academic actors. They were very good. And so I told them that I wanted to do this production of Julius Caesar. And I would cut it down to be played by 7 people, and it would last about an hour and 15 minutes. And we would do it all in original pronunciation. So a lot of our rehearsing would just be figuring out the language and learning what the accent was like and how to use it. And so we did 2 or 3 performances at U of H downtown, and a friend of mine saw it, and she said, Kate, this is just wonderful. You need to take it to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And it had never occurred to me to even think of such a thing, but it's true. It's 7 people plus a technician, and we had the support of the university, and they gave us a lot of support and financial as well as emotional and physical. And so we, about 4 years ago, we took it over to Edinburgh. It went very well. It was just fabulous. I fell in love with Edinburgh. And that was part of what makes me think if I were to continue to do more work, this would be what would give me, I think, the most pleasure.
You have some books here that I noticed. You've done more than work with adults. You've also worked with children's production, and you worked with the Houston Grand Opera doing some original work, I know. And you've also written children's books. I think maybe these other books you need to let us know something about how that came about.
Well, these 2 early books were the first things I actually wrote after college. I was living in Washington, D.C. with my husband, and I was doing some volunteer work in the public schools of Washington, D.C., where they had no libraries. And I was shocked that a school would exist without a library. And so I joined a group of senators' wives, I think they were. I don't remember because this was so long ago now. But they were doing volunteer work in the schools. And I went to one school where I was supposed to be acting as a librarian and talking to people. And I had a little girl sitting next to me who was reading the book I had brought called Roosevelt Grady. And she looked at the illustrations of the book and she looked at me and she said, "Is this book about Black people?" And I had chosen it because the students were mostly African American and I wanted to reach out to them. But what struck me was her intonation made me feel that she didn't think Black people were worth writing books about. And that was horrifying to me. So I started looking around for a book that I could write that would once again fill this kind of need. And so I used to walk back and forth to work past a fire station. And I thought, oh, now that would be an exciting story. We could write a book about children and a great fire and something really exciting. And so I wrote this little book called Bravest of All, which was published by Little Golden Books. And I only mention it because it's gone out of print in the years that have gone by. And I'm eager for it to get back into print. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do.
It seems very timely. I mean, there's a need for that.
That, and it's unusual to have a Black character on the cover. And so anyway, it was followed by another little book called Fritzy Goes Home, about a dog who misses his home when his family moves. And so he goes back to his home only to find that it's all closed up and dark and his family's not there. So it really says family, it's family that makes your home, not a space. And then when my friend Chesley Crone was head of early stages, she commissioned me to write a book about the Underground Railroad. And so the book was called Freedom Train and was published a couple of decades ago. And once again is about, it was brought out the year that the Underground Railroad State Park was opening. So now if you decide you want to go to an Underground Railroad passage, you can follow this map and go to these various stops on the Underground Railroad. It's called Freedom Train.
I think that I don't know about the Freedom Train or the history of it. Maybe I should.
You don't know about the Underground Railroad?
I think I should, but I don't.
When I'll leave this with you. You can read it. It's,
okay.
I think it's really important.
I think I need to read that.
Yeah.
I have a gap.
And there's I said at the beginning of the play that when I first heard about the Underground Railroad, I was just a kid, 11 or 12 years old. And I thought it was a real railroad. And it took a while for me to comprehend that, no, it was a metaphorical thing for getting people out of slavery. And so this was a play that I was actually quite proud of, and it was given several performances. And
I'm looking forward to reading that. Thank you. So before you retired, I know you worked on several productions with the Houston Grand Opera. This was Opera to Go, and it was directed for children, I believe.
Right. Once again, I was lucky. I had a friend of mine who's a composer had asked if I would work on a libretto for an opera that he wanted to write. He said he couldn't get the words on paper. I thought, words on paper, that's not so hard. It's music on paper that I find so daunting. So he and I wrote this little opera while we were living in Phoenix. And when we moved back to Houston, I started work at Houston Community College and was lucky enough that there was two young women there, Sue Ann Myers and Michelle Frazier, who wanted to start an opera company for the schools because they weren't getting enough, they weren't being hired to sing at night very much, and they both had kids and they just wanted to perform. So they decided if they did opera for the schools, they could work during the day and not have to worry about their nighttime schedules. So they asked me if I would do an adaptation of Hansel and Gretel, which was fun to do, and I think they're still performing it from time to time. Cut it down to about an hour's length, and it was performed for schools, and people were booking it. And so they wanted another opera for the next year. So I saw a illustrated version of the story of St. George and the Dragon in a bookstore, and I thought, ooh, that sounds like it could be a cool opera for kids with St. George and the dragon and the sword fights and the triumph of good over evil and all of that. So I did the libretto for this opera, and the man who had written asked me earlier to write an opera for the text for him, took it, and so we had the following year we had with Opera to Go a new opera along with Hansel and Gretel. And then we decided we needed another one the following year. So I did an original work called Daniel and the Dreamcatcher. So in the end, I wrote 12 operas for children, the text for 12 operas for children with various composers, Sterling Tinsley, Mary Carroll Warwick, and then ones like Hansel and Gretel that had the great composers. So that was a wonderful discovery because I loved being involved with musical work, and to feel that I could make the contribution of music and the words and then hear the music was fabulous. I really enjoyed it.
Well, you've taken us on quite a trip this afternoon in this hot weather, and I want to thank you so much for giving your time to so many of us that have been the beneficiaries of all of your hard work and efforts and contributions and the great explorations of wonderful history. Thank you.